I'm Matt.
Hey, I'm Steve.
Hey, I'm John.
This is the Sober Friends Podcast. We're here for the sober curious, the new guy, and the old timer. We're here to talk about the stuff anyone looking to live alcohol-free has to face day to day, and how we overcame those struggles. We speak for no 12-step group, but we do try to remain anonymous. You're not alone. This is the Sober Friends Podcast. I wanted to talk a little bit about my experience with the steps. I'm going to do this as a little bit of a series. May not do it every single week for 12 weeks, may break it up a bit, but I thought it would be helpful to talk a little bit about my experience with the steps as you can identify with my experience. Specifically, I wanted to talk a little bit about the high bottom drunk, because I always considered myself to have a higher bottom than other people. I'm sure there are a lot of people out there like you who may, or you may not. Either way, there's something for you to identify with. Why am I interested with the high bottom drinker? Well, back in the 1930s, the Big Book of AA talked a lot about the low bottom drunk. People like Bill, people like Bob. If you read those stories, if you read especially the first people who came into AA, you will see a very low bottom experience. They have lost it all. But do you have to lose it all to get sober? Do you have to lose it all to find some recovery? I think we can bring the bottom up to you. Why not? And this was something I really struggled with for a long time when I came into the rooms of Alcoholics Anonymous. I really felt like I didn't belong there. There were people there who had a lot, they had tougher stories than me. There was one guy who I sat next to who he said that he fell into the ER bleeding from his ass, his ears, his mouth, and his nose. And that was not my experience. So for the longest time, I didn't feel like I belonged because I didn't lose it all and I didn't wake up in a ditch. But I know I felt better being sober, and I know I felt better going to a 12-step meeting. And so I didn't really have anything to lose. It's not like, I stopped drinking and that's when my world fell apart. That's not the experience for people. So I made the decision that, you know what, this seems to be working for me. I'm going to stick around. So I thought I would walk you through a little bit of my journey through the steps and what I experienced. If you would like to see any of this stuff in kind of a written format, I've revamped the newsletter a little bit. You can go to soberfriendspod.com. At the very bottom, you can sign up for the newsletter. Over the years, I've tried a bunch of different things with the newsletter, and I think what feels most right, being given some very good feedback, is I'm kind of writing a blog post type thing that you can consume that also has a podcast associated with it. On the other hand, you can look and say there's a written blog post that goes along. There's a podcast here and there's a blog that goes along with what you're listening to now. So I'd love for you to sign up. It keeps us in connection. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about the first step with me. I stopped drinking in the moment watching a TV show where I saw somebody who was in recovery relapse. And there was just so long a period of time that I tinkered with the whole idea of getting sober. Back in early 2001, I stopped drinking for something like 10 months, and I picked up because of a breakup with a girl. I could not get past the first obstacle that I ran into because I didn't have something to replace the drinking with. I didn't have a program. I didn't have coping skills. So I could kind of keep my legs crossed in a certain way so I didn't go pee. But other than that, I really had nothing there. And sometimes I look back at that and say, 2001, it's 2024 now. I'd have like 23 years of sobriety and still be a young man. But you're always where you're supposed to be. and I have 10 really quality years of sobriety and not 24. And this is when I was supposed to be here. So if we look at step one, it is saying that alcohol was my master and my life had become unmanageable. Now, I could look at that I had that period of sobriety. I tinkered with the idea of stopping drinking all the way back in college, that I had always wanted to stop drinking, but I just couldn't. How am I going to meet a girl? How am I going to meet friends? How am I going to have a social life? If I stop drinking, the only thing that's going to happen is that I'm not going to leave my house. I'm going to be a monk. So with that mindset, it was tough to stop. But people who are normal drinkers don't go through those gymnastics all of those times and don't have a problem. So I knew I had a problem back in the late 90s. So that first one of, I feel as though that I'm powerless over alcohol. It is my king. That's an easy one. But that second part of the step of my life has become unmanageable, that's a tough one for me to get past. Going right back to the beginning of this podcast, I talked about how I wasn't like those other people. The guy who fell into the ER, who was bleeding from his ass, from his ears, from his mouth, from his nose, that's a pretty unmanageable situation. I know some people who got sober because they were thrown out of their house and they were homeless. That's a pretty unmanageable situation. I still had a house. I still had a family. Nobody was threatening to divorce me. I had a job. I had a car. I never had a DUI. So how is it that my life was unmanageable? Well, much like to get the people who you can reach before the alcoholism gets too bad, you have to raise the bottom to hit them, not the other way around. And for a lot of people, especially if you're somebody like me who consider themselves a high bottom drunk, you have to let the unmanageability hit you, not the other way around. And it really took a long time to think about this. And as I'm thinking about this podcast, it took me a lot of time to give this some thought, because I really started like, well, how was it unmanageable? What helped me understand that my life was unmanageable is when I had a speaker agreement. If you're not familiar with 12-step meetings, there's a whole bunch of different type of meetings: closed meetings, open meetings, literature meetings, discussion meetings. And there is the stereotypical 12-step meeting where somebody gets up front and they speak. And from time to time, I speak. Always like to speak. Sometimes you reach out to me and ask me, can you speak at my meeting? My answer is always going to be yes, unless I've got something family-wise going right at that time and there's no other dates. I'm going to say yes to a commitment. That's just kind of how I was raised in this program. So I spoke and I talked about how I went to this gathering and they had booze. And it was a family type of gathering. So my son was there. My middle daughter was born at this point, so she was there. And I was thinking, should I get a drink? Should I not get a drink? Can I have just one? Am I missing out by not drinking? This is an opportunity to drink. It's socially acceptable to drink. Other people are drinking. My wife's not drinking, but everybody else is drinking. If I drink, is that going to be okay? Can I have just one? Is it okay to have more than one? Can I have two? If I have a couple, will I be able to drink? Will my wife be able to drink? Are people going to get upset at me? Are they going to be looking at me? And I told this story and some woman came up. So I did this. I remember this meeting in a really nice part of Connecticut, West Hartford. And this woman comes up, well put together. She had a little bit of money. She had brand name bag. And she's like, dear, she didn't say my story was horrible, but she said, I can't believe the suffering that you had. And I'm thinking through, I'm like, when was I talking about suffering? I never fell. I never broke my arm. What are you talking about? She goes, that mental anguish around, are you going to drink? Are you not going to drink? That must have been awful. And I thought about it right there. I'm like, oh my God, it was awful. And I dismissed it because it's my own story. Because it's my own story, it's not awful to me. Everybody must go through that, but they don't. So just the presence of alcohol being around made my life unmanageable because there were mental gymnastics going on all the time. And if I look back, there were some pretty serious periods of time with financial difficulties. Those were exacerbated by my drinking. There was a job that I had for 3 months. This was an awful job. It was a business that I wasn't interested in. I didn't care about, but I probably could have asked for help, and I lost that job not because of physically drinking on the job, but the mental anguish around untreated alcoholism. So if you look back, I worked Saturdays for a lot of times, and I went in hungover every Saturday. I drank by myself. I drank after the family went to bed, and I didn't piss and moan about being hungover because I did this to myself. This was my cross to bear, and anytime that I went to work hungover, I just had to deal with it because I did this to myself. These are not the traits of people who have their lives under control. These may not be the traits of people who are totally unmanageable in the textbook definition. But this is also the idea of somebody where the thread is coming undone from the shirt. Holes are starting to form in the fabric, and given enough time, things are going to rip apart until you see me absolutely naked. Again, some of these experiences, this is not what normal people deal with. And it's what I was dealing with. And if I look at those experiences, it's hard for me not to say that my life wasn't unmanageable. I'm going to tell you something. People talk about steps being challenging. Oh, it's so hard to do the fourth step. It's so hard to do the fifth step of sharing that. Oh, it's so hard to do amends. It's so hard to do a 10th step because you're in a situation where or there's a confrontation. You can't get to those hard steps until you get past step 1. Anything past step 1 is so easy. Step 1 is the hardest step. At least it was for me. Because you have to admit that you actually have a problem. And for me to admit that I have a problem means I'm like my father. He was what I was totally trying to avoid my whole life. And I didn't avoid that because if I became like my father, maybe I would have all of the terrible characteristics of my father. And I did not want to have that. So I would drink up to a point so I didn't cross it, not realizing anybody who has that mindset has already crossed the line. I was already well over. So to have that terrible conversation with myself and say aloud that I'm an alcoholic was the hardest thing I've ever had to do. I said at my first meeting, I wasn't prepared to say it, but I did, and it just came out. Some of you may not feel comfortable with the alcoholic term, and that's okay. I love the alcoholic term. I love that it has those ramifications that it can be an unseemly word because it's a reminder to me of what I really am if I don't take care of myself. So I totally embrace the term. If you want to say I have a drinking problem, that I want to give up alcohol, that I have alcohol use disorder, however you want to define it, that's okay. And don't let anybody tell you otherwise. If you want to say something like alcohol use disorder, even if you want to say I have AUD or I can't safely drink, whatever you need to say that reminds yourself that you can't do this safely anymore. And that the very lowest bar that you have to cross to have meaningful sobriety is you have to admit the problem first. then that's what you need to do. Because you can't see that your life has been unmanageable if you don't see first that you have a problem. The unmanageable thing for me, that's easy. I was looking to see, well, tell me where my life has been unmanageable, and then this will be easier for me. And once you get past, like even the God stuff, if we start talking about the God stuff's hard. God stuff is nothing. That can be dealt with down the road. But saying first that you have a problem with alcohol and I can't do this safely anymore, that can be an incredibly freeing experience. And it was an incredibly free experience to me. Here is what I'd like to ask of you. I'd love to know if this resonates with you, of hearing just kind of a personal story, not me going through, here's what step 1 is, here's what step 2 is, of I'm going to give you a personal experience of what my experience was with each one of these steps. And then asking you, can you identify with those feelings? Give me a holler on Instagram at SoberFriendsPod. The website is soberfriendspod.com, where you can link right there and send me an email. Sometimes I get these emails and I overlook them, so I'm sorry if I haven't gotten back to you. I really would love to open that conversation. Something else. You may not have seen this. I'm doing a little bit of a soft launch on YouTube. So on these episodes where there's no Steve, I'm going to put the video up on YouTube so you can see a little bit about what the podcast looks like, maybe put some clips up there. I'm trying to help look at other avenues to market this, to reach other people. So on YouTube, Sober Friends Pod, I would love for you to go on there, subscribe, click that you like it, and leave a comment so other people can see it. Heck, if you like this podcast, share it with somebody else who needs it. Go and put a review on Apple Podcasts. Give it a rating on Spotify. All those things. And if you give us a review, I'm going to read it on the podcast. All right. You know how you know it's time to end the podcast? My dog upstairs is barking and he wants to come inside. I can't even get away for 15, 20 minutes. So we're going to do something else. Might go through my experience with step 2, or maybe we have something else coming up. Anyways, thanks for listening to the show, and we'll see you next week. Bye, everybody.
You made it this far into the podcast. That tells me you're a pretty big fan. If you like what we do and you find value in the podcast, consider a donation at buymeacoffee.com/SoberFriendsPod. Your donation keeps us on the air to help out the new guy and helps us defray some of our costs. If you find value in our podcast, please consider a donation at buymeacoffee.com/SoberFriendsPod.